Hi, Imran. Welcome. Thank you for being with me today.
Thank
Uh,
you. Thank you
uh,
for the
I'm
opportunity.
I'm so happy to have you with me. Together with you, I would like to explore the effects of COVID-19 on diversity and inclusion. And anybody who's watching us right now may think that why diversity? For me, being someone who has been living abroad for 16 years in 4 different countries and working as a global coach, diversity and inclusion is not just a subject or a name of the department which should be established within organizations. It's a mission. And
Mm.
I know that it is exactly the same for you. You have an international background. You have recently started working as a partner in August Leadership in New York. But before your current role, you worked for PepsiCo for 25 years, and you were based in 4 very different locations: Istanbul, Hong Kong, Dubai, and New York. And your latest role at PepsiCo was Chief Global Diversity and Engagement Officer.
Yes.
Is there anything that you would like to add? So I introduce you in that way?
No, thank you. It was very short and actually to the point. So, yes, diversity means a lot to me beyond my job, previous job, or current job. And I think it's, as you say, it's a way of looking at life, talent, and also how we create innovation and growth. So, therefore, I would like to see that we have that invisible and visible differences in the same environment, creating a synergy. And at the end of the day, the creativity, the innovation, the growth, especially for the organizations, I think, in the right environment, inclusive environment. So that's one side of the equation, more from a corporate lens. But in my life, I really would like to explore new things, cultures, especially because I danced for 12 years, throughout my student years, and I was basically practicing the Turkish folk dance, folk music. So I have this interest in basically the authentic cultural values and the folk, basically, the folklore of countries. So that gives me a lot of actually understanding of why things happen. So as I moved around with my family, from Istanbul to Hong Kong, Dubai, and now being in the US, it's always that, understanding, researching, what kind of cultural elements are in that environment. And then making sure that, first of all, I can appropriately, take them into my leadership style and adapt, because every country is different. In Asia, I lived in Hong Kong maybe with
Right.
my family, but I was managing from Japan to Australia to Pakistan, a big triangle of, Asia Pacific region as the president. So it's very important to understand what each country is, caring for. I had 20 people in my team from different backgrounds. So I had to really know what they care for and what is disturbing for those cultures and nationalities. So that's what I find fascinating about diversity and how inclusive environments can create value for human beings, but also for companies, organizations, governments, nations. I think that's very important.
Mhm, mhm. What is your definition of diversity? What is diversity for you?
Yeah, for me, as I said, it's the visible and invisible differences, backgrounds coming together and creating value.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. So the question regarding the effects of COVID-19 on diversity and
Mhm.
inclusion, the lessons from previous crises tell us there is a very real risk that inclusion and diversity may be neglected as a strategic priority for organizations. This is what we experienced in 2018. So the question in my mind is, Imran, and I would like to have your opinion. Diversity and inclusion is something which can only exist or be invested in a kind word. So is it a money dependent thing that gets affected in the times of crisis, or is if it is a mindset, and if it is once established and structured within an organization, it shouldn't get easily affected in times of crisis? What do you think about it?
I mean, first of all, I think it's a philosophy. It's part of your values as an individual or as an organization. Um, and it's part of how you act, behave. So, of course, there is some dependency on maybe financial resources for organizations to improve this agenda, but it really starts with, as you say, with the mindset of, we definitely need it because it's the right thing to do uh, for the business, but also for our communities, I mean, it's the right thing to do, period. So you have to have it first of all, and doesn't matter if you're in crisis or good times, and then after that, when the situation gets tougher for the business, especially for the organizations, if we are talking, I mean, you have to, of course, adjust some of the financial resources you are allocating for each matter. And of course, diversity budget, inclusion budget might get impacted, but budget is only one part of the equation. So we will talk about later, what kind of strategic approaches can you bring to this topic. And also we will talk about actually in the beginning of the crisis with COVID-19, we all felt that, diversity and inclusion might be, behind the scenes, not as active as, other matters, but look what happened. And in the last 3 months, and even in the last 2-3 weeks, everything changed dramatically because first it was of course, the virus, the safety of people, and also some of the, guidelines to operate. Actually, the people topic was always in the center of the crisis in general. So that was good because most of the leaders actually were focusing on the people, how they will be safe, if they are working in the front lines or if they are working at home, the well-being. Um, people was in the center. I think in general that was the good part. But then what happened, we have observed that especially in places like United States, some groups were impacted heavily and disproportionately in this crisis, like the African American Black communities in the US, Hispanic communities in the US, and Asians actually, they have seen serious signs of racism during that time. So looking at all of those things, companies and organizations started, showing signs of, okay, what are we going to do about it? At the moment, it was more about helping those communities, supporting those communities. But later, unfortunate events, the killing of course, George Floyd was the peak, but before that also there were other cases happening all maybe like in a week or two. So that brought a lot of attention, and as you know, the protests here, but even globally. So as a result, diversity and inclusion became in the center of things, from the point of, in our first conversation, we thought it might be neglected, but there is no way it can be neglected now. So you see a lot of companies, organizations, of course, making very high level declarations, either as a commitment, or I started even seeing specific commitments in terms of what they will do, what kind of investments, recruitment, community support they are going to give. So now it's in the center of things, definitely.
And would you be willing to share, what actions, what decisions were taken at PepsiCo while you were, working over there. I think it can be a good
Sure.
role model. My concern is which role should private sector be playing in that regard?
It's a very critical role for sure. I mean, at the end of the day, these kind of societal, I think, areas, topics can only be resolved or improved, let's call it, cannot be totally resolved,
Mm,
but improved with the support of private sector, public sector, and also, of course, the nonprofit
position.
organizations. So it's definitely a partnership, but the role of the private sector and my role, as you mentioned, I was with PepsiCo for 25 years, and starting in 2006, I became, the general manager of a major Middle East business unit of 5 countries. And I have seen that I was the only woman in the room as a general manager. So at that point, I really started, focusing on diversity, especially at that time, more from the gender perspective, given it was Middle East. And then later it was Southeast Europe. Before it was only Turkey, moving to Asia Pacific. So gender diversity and bringing more women into the room, business, executive roles and boardrooms, it became a focus for me, but also a passion for me because that was the right thing to do. Again, in our kind of consumer goods business, 70% of the shoppers are women.
Mm,
So you can't ignore the fact that they are part of the decision making seriously, and also they are, I mean, well educated in most of the countries after, because we started seeing, as you know, 55-60% of certain educational institutions today, they declare, the girls and women are coming out of the pipeline. So that's basically how I started focusing on it. But in time, moving to Asia Pacific, as you say, it became also more the cultural and multi-country diversity, how you work with different cultures, because it was really complicated, having 20, 21 different nationalities in one team. Coming to Dubai, it was even like, I mean, local employees and local actually people in the location, they were the minority, which was very different than other places. So Dubai was really a very comfortable place for most foreigners. In the schools, in the workplace, they were all working together, coming from different places. And I remember, I mean, you would have like maybe 200 different nationalities in some schools.
mhm.
So in the workplace, at least 40, 50 nationalities.
Okay.
In that regard, I think you start focusing on the cultural aspect more and more, how you make sure people are included and have a comfortable environment to bring their ideas and authentic self to work. And coming to US, of course, the focus became more of the all of the above, but also the ethnic cohorts in the US, especially African American, Black, Hispanic, Latinos, Latinas, and then Asian Americans, Native Americans. So it's a very rich culture also here. It's one big country, but it's really the same. I think the historical cultural diversity is here. So looking at all of that personally, I moved into the my last role, Chief Global Diversity and Engagement Officer. With all this background, focus, and passion, I really wanted to bring the change or continue what PepsiCo was doing since 1940s. Given that it was a consumer goods company in 1940s, they started actually recruiting African American salespeople. They had in 1960s a sales vice president, again, Harvey Russell. Um, so it became part of the DNA.
Mm,
Therefore, I think it was important to continue that journey, and we decided to have 3 pillars: represent the society,
mm,
make sure that it's an inclusive environment, and the third is the supporting the communities. So with that strategic framework, actually, I can dive into each area, but I will stop here and give you the chance to ask the next question because there is a lot to share in
Yes.
those pillars.
Yeah, I mean, I am the first of all, my understanding from you, please correct me if I am wrong, diversity, gender equality can be one of the pillars, you know, under diversity, but, you know, diversity goes beyond gender equality, I think.
Absolutely,
So this is
absolutely, yeah.
something, maybe it was a starting point, but I'm curious to know, is there any specific actions, or is there a specific strategy that you focused on during the COVID-19,
Yes,
you know, in terms of, you know,
yeah,
sticking to this inclusiveness and engagement?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So as we mentioned actually in the beginning, the safety of the employees, of course, was the first thing for any company, any organization, any state. So most of the PepsiCo employees, they were in the front lines, of course, you know, working in terms of manufacturing, moving, selling the products. Uh, so their safety was number one. And also for them to feel comfortable to go to work. On the one hand, I think they were very happy, proud to contribute or being part of the essential workforce during that time. But on the other hand, the job of the company, of course, was making sure they were totally protected as much as they can, right? So all the uh, protective materials and other support. For example, incentives during that time, they were given extra incentives. In terms of also healthcare support, it was made definitely much easier than before, just to make sure they can be taken care of. But looking at the people working at home, for them, it was also how do you include everybody on a Zoom call? So one approach is you just listen to who speaks. The other approach is you ask people who actually do not participate, right? So I think new techniques of inclusion were needed, but also we have seen, I think people were more informal, more comfortable, more authentic. Their families, kids, pets, they were on the screen, sometimes joining the meeting. So it made things actually a little easier in terms of being more human.
Mhm.
So that's the other part. But if you look at the communities aspect, after all the statistics were on the table in terms of the disproportionately impacted groups like African Americans and Hispanic and Latinos, PepsiCo decided to support actually in total about $7 million, 1 million each to National Urban League and also Unidos US. And then the remaining 5 million from the PepsiCo Foundation was distributed in the key cities with different organizations depending on the needs of that specific city. So that's still continuing, actually. That activity is still continuing. And yesterday I have seen another important announcement that they will specifically commit more than $400 million in the next, actually, 5 years for Black uh, Black community support in terms of people, in terms of business and communities. So it's the role of the private sector, definitely,
Mhm.
to be part of this agenda and make sure that communities and talent, people, um, are really being groomed to have the life that they deserve.
Mhm. 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 Yeah, I fully agree with you. Uh, but my concern is, I don't know what you're thinking. I still see the risk of a rise of xenophobia and racism due to COVID-19, because there is the assumption, often the assumption that the virus comes from the outside. Right?
Yeah,
So the
yeah,
more we open the borders, or the more we mingle, the more we travel, the more there is the risk the virus will spread. So what can we do in organizations in order to help our employees transfer their cognitive level awareness into their behavior? So they're not required to pay attention. They shouldn't be only required to pay attention this diversity inclusiveness thing within the organization, but in order to be able to demonstrate this mindset when they're outside.
I mean, we have seen already in the initial phases of COVID-19 that our Asian American, let's say, cohorts in the US, they have seen a lot of, signs of racism, unfortunately, because it was called Chinese virus. It was mentioned as coming from China.
Unfortunately.
And at the end of the day, I mean, yeah, it started in China, but what does it mean for the Asian Americans in the US? Maybe they have never been to China, even some of them, but doesn't matter. People have those, prejudices sometimes based on the news and what they see, what they read and hear. So it's very unfortunate to see all that stuff, especially, the Asian Americans in the healthcare. They have seen very, unfortunate signs of racism. Also, people on the streets, in the subways, in the trains. So what happened as a result, some organizations like, for example, Ascent, some organizations like Asian American Business Development Council, they started putting together statements, and they invited organizations to support actually those statements and making sure that, we stand together against racism, and increase the level of training, unconscious bias training, inclusive leadership training, etc. So that happened significantly in the beginning of the crisis here. Now, going forward, of course, we will continue seeing that, hearing that, unfortunately still continue, I'm sure, but there was a real reaction in the beginning, the first couple of months in that regard, together, all the organizations getting together who care for these matters. So going forward, I think we have to be mindful of the risks still, it's not totally gone. So it's everybody's responsibility as a company or as an individual, I think, to continue protecting ourselves and others. I think that's the most important part of this equation, that we all, I think, have a responsibility to stay safe.
And I believe this is something we can only achieve when we start working together. That's why I would like to have this type of recordings or calls with people from the universities. I would like to invite some university professors and some people from the NGOs. Because all together we can achieve it. I have one more question, because it's about the gender equality. So since we are discussing the diversity and inclusion, I can't skip this part. I read some articles which argue that in times of crisis, it's always the women who are supposed or required to go back to their traditional roles. So, and COVID-19 has had bigger effects on the lives of females than males, because, it is them who needs to accompany their kids' homeworks, because kids are, are home as well. So my concern is when we start going back to the normal, when organizations start designing the groups of people who are required to work from the office, do you think these groups may be male dominant, even though females would you like to go back to their work? So what might be the effects of COVID-19 on the professional lives of women
Yeah,
in
thank you.
in
I
the
think every organization and the overall, human resources, human capital functions, they started also questioning what is the future of work, office space, flexible policies, because we have all seen that, working from home using different technologies can work. It's not like it has to be face to face all the time. And most, companies, organizations, they had some flexible policies already, but it was maybe, one day, maybe Friday, out of home and the rest from the office. Now, most probably it will reverse. And if you have a long commute, maybe you will only come to the office once or twice. So for the companies, I think it's important to adjust their flexible policies to the new reality.
Mhm,
Especially, I mean, depending on how the schools will open or not, there is still a lot of, childcare, or, I mean, even if they are grown up, supporting their work, homework, etc., kind of responsibilities. So if schools do not open, then definitely going back to work is going to be very challenging
mhm,
for women and men, because at the end in the US we have seen, I mean, there was a lot of support and sharing in the households, but in some cultures, as you know, women are more into this kind of work. So yes, they might be impacted, especially if the offices open earlier than schools. That's a big risk, unfortunately. So we are hoping that the schools can open, childcare can be, especially in the early stages, childcare can be managed in the ways they were being managed. But if not, I think working from home will continue and should continue. So the adjustments of flexible policies will be critical. Sharing responsibilities in the homes, man, woman. I mean, that's the essence of equality anyhow. And we know that unfortunately some cultures are less prone to that, but we are hopeful that the new generations will demonstrate more of that equality, in the houses also, not only at the workplace, because we are expecting them to um, share the responsibilities in the house. I mean, that's the essence of equality. Um, and the third part, most probably, that I think the face to face, the concept of face to face will only be, it should be only be kept for very important matters. I mean, not for every meeting. Can we decrease the number of meetings? Can we make them shorter? Can we make them more focused? So there will be a lot of questions. I mean, using technology, of course, is key, but using data, not spending a lot of time in the meetings, reviewing slides, but everybody comes prepared. All of those disciplines will be, I think, part of the future of communication. So I'm hopeful, but I mean, everybody needs to share the responsibility. Companies, women, men.
mhm,
I think that's critical. And the school systems, we hope, will be opening. Companies like PepsiCo, we had an on-site childcare facility, for example, in Purchase, which was a
mhm,
great
mhm,
benefit for the ones, who were benefiting from, of course. I'm sure they are really looking forward for a safe opening. Then they will also like to go back to work, because some people, they want to go back to work, as you know. They don't like to work from home every day. The homes also may not be as comfortable as the office,
true.
depending on where you come from. So, I mean, it has been a very interesting experience, I think, for the workforce and
It
management.
is, yeah.
And we learned a lot.
Mhm, 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 mhm. Our time is up, is already up, but I would like to ask you, is there any message that you would like to give to people who have been working in diversity and inclusion, who really see this inclusiveness as a mission? What last message uh, would you like to give?
I mean, being in the diversity and inclusion space is definitely an important space for those professionals. But at the end, every leader, every leader has to play the diversity and inclusion role in their everyday life, first of all. So what it suggests that you have to bring the leadership into your agenda early on. You should have the data and use the power of data and goals and targets to achieve certain representation aspects. But it's only one part of the equation. You know, how do you include, how do you make sure, you know, the voice of everybody is heard? Employee resource groups, of course, is a big help, but also continuous training, exchange, dialogue, and we call it courageous engagement. In the tough times, you know, having the conversation, open conversation is very important. And making sure also the communities where you operate are also benefiting from your thinking and resources together with your employee resource groups. But everything starts with leadership, their understanding, their communication, their commitment. So let's bring the leaders into the game. We can only succeed together.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And I am so
Thank
happy that,
you.
you know, you are still hopeful. And this is something we shouldn't lose, I think. It's important, especially in the
Absolutely.
times of crisis.
Absolutely.
Ümran, thank you so
Thank
much. Thank you
you.
for your time. Thank you for your sharing your experiences and opinions with us.
Thank you very
Bye.
much. Bye.